History as it happens, March 20th, 2023. The Iraq War.
Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center.
Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction.
What evidence does the U.S. have that Iraq, Saddam Hussein, may be getting close again to obtaining a nuclear weapon?
Oh, I think I'll leave that for the coming days and weeks.
The question, Mr. Speaker, is not whether we like Saddam Hussein or not. The question is whether he represents an imminent threat to the American people and whether a unilateral American invasion of Iraq will do more harm than good.
I truly believe that history has called us.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option.
Any vote that might lead to war should be hard, but I cast it with conviction.
The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now.
The U.S. invasion of Saddam Hussein's Iraq was tragic and unnecessary. Over the course of the past 2 decades of military occupation and internecine carnage, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, millions were displaced, and trillions of dollars were spent trying to remake the Middle East in our image. A crime we can't forget that compels us to get the story right. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The read we get on the people of Iraq is there's no question but what they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and they will welcome as liberators the United States.
You're with us or with the terrorists. Shock and awe. Mission accomplished.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Axis of evil will be greeted as liberators, weapons of mass destruction. So many phrases, so many slogans live on in the American memory from the days and months after 9/11, all of which I look back on now with derision, for they symbolize the intractable disaster caused by the United States in the greater Middle East. If not outright lies, claims about weapons of mass destruction and the ease with which the U.S. would prevail over Saddam Hussein were made by our leaders as if they were incontestable. No doubts. When there were, in fact, many doubts about what would happen inside Iraq, as then Congressman Bernie Sanders made clear before voting against the war.
Mr. Speaker, the front page of the Washington Post today reported that all relevant U.S. intelligence agencies now say, despite what we have heard from the White House, that, quote, Saddam Hussein is unlikely to initiate a chemical or biological attack against the United States, end quote.
But the war resolution passed by large majorities, 296 to 133 in the House and 77 to 23 in the U.S. Senate.
It is clear, however, that if left unchecked, Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological and chemical warfare and will keep trying to develop nuclear weapons. Should he succeed in that endeavor, he could alter the political and security landscape of the Middle East, which, as we know all too well, affects American security.
It did appear like things might be going okay at first. In early April 2003, a large crowd of Iraqis, with the help of U.S. military hardware, tore down the statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad.
The scene in central Baghdad.
Earlier today, we saw this crowd, this small crowd that has swelled to this now.
It felt like you were watching a turning point in history, the end of a cruel dictatorship, the blossoming of something better.
The statue crumbled at the knees and toppled over. It's still hanging from the pedestal, but as it collapsed...
The scenes of free Iraqis celebrating in the streets, riding American tanks, tearing down the statues of Saddam Hussein in the center of Baghdad are breathtaking.
But it did not take long for reality to break through. Iraq quickly disintegrated, and soon a large insurgency challenged the U.S. military occupation. Civil war followed, and President Bush's dreams were buried in the mass graves of the slaughtered. Our purpose over the next couple episodes is not to go over the entire history of the war. Rather, it is to reckon with its failures and lingering consequences for our leaders, the news media, our society at large, and the people of Iraq. To come to grips with the numbers of dead, wounded, displaced, and the amount of dollars wasted. Historian Andrew Bacevich is the chairman of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He'll join us in a moment. First, let's talk to Catherine Lutz, the co-founder and co-director of the Costs of War Project at Brown University, an invaluable resource of data on the global war on terrorism. Find it at watson.brown.edu/costs of war. Catherine Lutz, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Martin.
It's been about 18 months. You last joined me when we talked about the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So we do anniversary shows. Not very good memories, though. So this may sound like an obvious question, but what is the importance of quantifying the toll of the war in Iraq, whether it's lives lost? That is obvious why we need to know that. Basically a starting point, wouldn't you say, that we need to have some actual numbers to look at?
Absolutely. There is a tendency to underestimate the costs of going to war in terms of the time it will take, the money it will cost, the humans who will be hurt or affected. So I think it's really important to take those assumptions that we often begin with, that governments begin with, the U.S. government began with, and correct the misimpression, because they're much more costly than people assume.
And technically, the war isn't over yet. I mean, the use of force authorization is still active, right?
And there are still American soldiers, boots on the ground in Iraq. People assume it's over. It is not.
In terms of Iraqi lives lost, what have you found?
Well, there are direct costs in terms of humans who died in the war. We have an estimate of about 550,000 Iraqis and Americans, but mostly Iraqis, who died during the war up till today. And that's the direct cost, people who died of bombs and bullets. And again, not all at the hands of U.S. soldiers, often, again, in the civil war that followed the destabilization of Iraqi society and the sectarianism that was really amplified and installed as a principle of governance by the Constitution the U.S. put in there. So we have direct deaths and we have indirect deaths, and those can be up to 4 times that number. So we're talking about up to 2 million people who died, if you include, again, people who died as a result of the war. So the destroyed infrastructure, sewage and water facilities that were damaged and resulted in various kinds of diseases and deaths.
Would you say your estimates are on the conservative side, that you're trying to be cautious? Because there are some estimates that are higher.
Oh, absolutely. We're being conservative because it is very hard to count the number of people who die in a war zone, no matter where you are. By definition, the chaos, the loss of government functions where normally deaths would be counted and recorded, the loss of medical facilities where this would normally give us the numbers, that's all gone. But rather than guess, we take those numbers that have been established. But we know that because of the chaos of the war, they're insufficient.
Somebody could be a civilian one day and then be really angry that their family was killed by a U.S. airstrike and then join the insurgency. I mean, what's the difference between an insurgent and an ordinary Iraqi, right?
The statuses are blurry, but we have rules of warfare that suggest the kinds of protections that can be afforded to civilians. You can't be conservative there. You have to bend over backwards to ensure that you're not executing people where that would violate the rules of warfare.
Azmat Khan at the New York Times has done amazing work. Pulitzer Prize, I believe, winning work on this issue of the number of civilians killed by the U.S. military. One of the data points in your study, in your paper, that's at the Costs of War website. Everyone should check it out. I'll even put a link to it at our story page at WashingtonTimes.com. Actually, before I get there, I just wanted to make one other point here. Population of Iraq in 2003 was 27 million people. So you said several 100,000 killed by direct violence, about 2 million killed by the overall effects of the war. So put that into perspective. That is truly staggering.
The outmigration as well, that population figure that you mentioned, is now again lowered because of all of the people who fled the violence across borders That, again, is in the millions. It was a catastrophic set of losses that Iraq suffered. And again, the war didn't just start in 2003. I want to just make sure that your listeners understand that in some ways the war in Iraq began in the 1980s when the United States was supporting Iraq in the war against Iran. But then certainly after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States attacked to expel Saddam from Kuwait in 1991. From there on forward, up to 2003, the United States imposed really punishing sanctions, no-fly zone, a kind of an aerial occupation in the north and the south of the country, was prosecuted for many years. So 2003 was a very important date, but it's not the beginning of the war.
I remember when Madeleine Albright was asked about the toll of the sanctions by Leslie Stahl on CBS News, and she said it was worth the price. It's hard to find a precise figure, an estimate of how many Iraqis died as a result of the sanctions. I mean, there have been different studies saying different things, but everyone can agree that the toll on the civilian population was terrible. So I was going to say, before I went back to the Iraqi population figure, that one of the key points in the Costs of War paper is that in the first month or so of the war after the invasion in 2003, March 2003, about 7,000 Iraqi civilians were killed by the U.S. military, many of them in airstrikes. And I think that's so important to establish that figure because one of the main reasons there was an insurgency, and I'm not talking about the looting and the chaos that immediately followed the toppling of the Hussein regime, I'm talking about the insurgency that followed that. One of the big reasons for that was simply the number of people who were being killed by the occupation.
The tendency of Americans to think, and our government to argue, that wars will be fought surgically and hygienically, that only bad guys will be hurt. That just never turns out to be the case. It does fuel itself, and the war went on for decades and now because of that phenomenon, that innocents die and people don't like to have their country occupied for yet another thing. So we could have predicted that the Iraq war would have gone the way it did here, which is to say quite horribly and catastrophically.
We will be greeted as liberators. I've talked with a lot of Iraqis in the last several months myself, had them to the White House. The President and I have met with them, various groups and individuals, people who've devoted their lives from the outside to trying to change things inside Iraq. Men like Kanan Makia, who's a professor at Brandeis, but an Iraqi, he's written great books about the subject, knows the country intimately, is a part of the democratic opposition and resistance. The read we get on the people of Iraq is there's no question but what they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and they will welcome as liberators the United States.
Another key point that is often overlooked when we talk about the human toll, we all know that about 4,500 Americans have been killed in the war, but 32,000 wounded. Why do you think that number is overlooked?
It's a good question. I don't actually know why Americans don't pay as much attention to that. I think people assume that people will recover. You have an injury and you get good care and you recover, but these are often lifelong injuries, catastrophic injuries. And we also know that for this war, because of the advances in battlefield medicine, because of the nature of the weaponry that was used, that some of these injuries that were not survivable back in World War II or Korea are now, people survive, but again, with very diminished lives.
That's right. That number kind of obscures the ferocity of the combat, right? When you say, quote unquote, only 4,000 Americans over the course of 20 years. Of course, it's not an only, because no American should have died in Iraq. The war shouldn't have started. But the 32,000 wounded is quite a large number. So
that is also an inadequate number if we look at the larger question of who was wounded not during the battle, but afterwards or as a result of. So we have people who have various kinds of respiratory injuries that only emerge over time, only get diagnosed after people return to the States. We have people who suffer traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress. And again, you add many, many more tens of thousands of people to that, the number you gave.
That's right. Veteran suicides have been a horrible consequence of this as well.
Absolutely.
I laughed, but not in a ha-ha funny way, when I read about in the Cost of Wars report the initial estimates as to how much the war would cost. Your report says on December 31st, 2002, Mitch Daniels, then director of the Office of Management and Budget, estimated the costs of war with Iraq would be $50 to $60 billion. I mean, they missed it by about $2 trillion. So break down that $2 trillion figure that this war will ultimately cost.
The number of dollars that were spent directly on the war is one part of that figure. And the total actually is almost $3 trillion.
Okay.
So that number includes the what's called the OCO budget, dollars spent directly on provisioning the operations. It includes medical and disability care for veterans expended to date. It includes interest on the debt, since this war was funded on a credit card. Billions more for these other factors, which are absolutely costs that the federal budget would not have incurred were it not for the war, including future costs for interest. That actually raises the figure much higher than $3 trillion even.
That was one of the only times in American history, maybe the only time, where the country went to war without raising taxes, figuring out a way to pay for it. There's also the cost of care, medical care for U.S. veterans, right? That's going to be very large in the coming decades.
Yeah. And far into the future. Yes, absolutely.
In September 2002, U.S. House of Representatives Democratic Budget Committee estimated costs of a war against Iraq $48 to $93 billion. Why do you think we do this all the time, underestimate the costs of war? Is it simply that we don't expect it's going to take 2 decades? Is it as simple as that?
It is partly that. I think it's partly also the drumbeat of war. People want to believe, in government and out, that this will be quick, cheap, and easy, that the campaign will achieve its objectives, that the cost will be low, that very few people will be hurt. It's a wish. It's a desire. It's not a science that anybody applies to this. If they did, it would cause hesitation, possibly the decision not to go to war.
Also in this episode, I'll be speaking to Andrew Bacevich, the historian and now head of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I believe he also contributed to your work in this project over the past decade or so. He wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs saying, "The Reckoning That Wasn't." How would Catherine Lutz answer that question? What haven't we learned?
Oh, wow. Well,
in 4 hours or less.
Yes. What haven't we learned? That war is not a game, that nobody wins in most wars, in any war, that the costs are borne not by the people who wage the war, but by others, that the people who win are often the arms manufacturers, people who come to help prosecute the war, but only because they're, again, about to make billions of dollars. U.S. corporations who won this war can feel good today, but almost no one else involved can. But I think we've been led to forget by so many things, even when the lesson is really fresh in our minds. We've had a media that has tended not to ask the hard questions that you're asking right now. Our media is already on to other spectacles. They'll stop for the anniversary, but in general, not take their cameras to Iraq and ask what the long-term impact on that country has been. So our media is not really asking the hard questions that would help us to understand what war is really about. In addition, we have an all-volunteer force. We have fought this war on credit card, and that means that nobody really bore the cost of the war in the United States. We're not led to ask the hard questions by our experience.
I have to agree with all the points you've made, especially about the media. I no longer hesitate to say that the war was a crime against the people of that nation, just as Vietnam was a crime against the people of Vietnam. Yet, today, people like Paul Bremer, David Frum, just to name two, I just spotted articles or pieces that they wrote in recent days. Bremer was head of the military occupation. It was called the Coalition Provisional Authority after Jay Garner was there for a short time. And then David Frum was a member of the Bush administration, a speechwriter, a communications guy. They've recently come out to say, well, some of this actually worked out okay if we reassess things 20 years later. How do you respond to these arguments?
Oh, well, first of all, I think Paul Bremer should be in a hidey hole. I find it quite remarkable that he can come out in public and claim that good things happen as a result of that war, even one or two good things. And the claim that we have created a stable democracy in Iraq is absolutely demonstrably wrong. The Democracy Index has 164 countries of the world that they've evaluated for the strength of their democratic institutions. Iraq today is at number 124 out of 164. That puts it squarely in the authoritarian categories. The corruption, the levels of corruption in Iraq are super high. On the Corruption Perception Index, at a score of a possible 100, they score 23. Right? So Paul Bremer's understanding of this is, again, wish fulfillment, not based in the data.
That's right. We turned Iraq from a Sunni secular dictatorship into a Shia autocracy with ties to Iran. The government of Nouri al-Maliki was autocratic, wasn't democratic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this is very, very depressing because I tend to agree with what you and Andrew Bacevich have said about this and others, that we truly haven't learned. And it's not that we have forgotten it. I think most people today know that this happened. It's just we don't feel it. It's not front of mind anymore. But I hear and this will be my final point, I do hear in President Biden's rhetoric about Ukraine, although the United States is not sending troops to Ukraine, some of the same simplistic thinking, simplistic worldview that we've heard, well, from most U.S. presidents, with the possible exception of Donald Trump, that the U.S. is the hegemon and it is our responsibility to make sure freedom and democracy thrives.
It is very frustrating to see that narrative continue and to see the Pentagon budget increase dramatically over time, over these 20 years. And just in the last budget proposal from President Biden, we see increase in the number of dollars going to those military industrial corporations like Lockheed Martin, like Raytheon. And to really have the kind of media coverage of how that happens, how the capture of our federal budgeting process by those powerful corporations has resulted in such misplaced priorities. Again, at the cost of all of the other possible functions of government. We are now a nation made by war, made for war. And it really is something that a movement of people to ask the harder questions and to demand change.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Andrew Bacevich, hello and welcome back.
Oh, thank you.
It's an honor to have you here as we discuss something that, as I prepared to talk about, did not bring back any good memories, brought back a lot of anger, and I'm sure the same for you. Why haven't, or what haven't, Americans learned from the Iraq War disaster? What haven't we truly reckoned with?
Well, that's a very pertinent question, and I must say it's a very tough question. And I guess my answer begins with what I believe is there really has been a willful determination to forget, put the unpleasant memories behind us. Let's not talk about the Iraq War, its origins, or its conduct. And I think that the political establishment and the American people are equally guilty on that score. I mean, one of the things that struck me, I don't mean to get us off the topic here, but one of the things that struck me is that the Ukraine war, the appearance of the Ukraine war, the eruption of the Ukraine war really provided an additional excuse to forget about Iraq, forget about Afghanistan, forget about the entire post-9/11 period, because now we can focus on the evils of Vladimir Putin. I don't think that we are an especially reflective people, and the post-9/11 military misadventures really call for reflection. I mean, I would say they call for repentance, but that tends to be not what we're about. You know, we move on to the next thing.
Was the invasion by the U.S. a crime?
Oh, I think so. It was a crime in the sense that the 9/11 attacks, and let us emphasize, I'm not an insider. I had nothing to do with any of this, but I can imagine myself to have been working in the White House at 9/11. And if I put myself in that situation, I can easily imagine the panic and the humiliation that I would have felt, and that I believe President Bush felt and the people around him felt. Panic. Nothing like this has ever happened in our history. This is 10 times worse than Pearl Harbor, and they're responsible. So in that sense, the overreaction and the misguided reaction becomes at least slightly understandable from a human perspective. Doesn't excuse them for their recklessness, and excuse them for their stupidity, doesn't excuse the fact that the war was a crime. Why was it a crime? Because 9/11 became the basis of the Bush Doctrine. And the Bush Doctrine was a statement at the highest levels of the United States government that empowered us exclusively, no other country in the world, empowered us to engage in preventive war. To start a war targeting somebody, something that we felt could potentially pose a threat. No other nation since probably Adolf Hitler laid claim to that kind of authority. We did. The result was disaster. I don't think that the Bush administration can be forgiven for that.
And they engaged in torture and kidnappings and black sites and all these other ugly things as well. When you look at the sanctions of the 1990s and the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who died based on all the best reporting out there as a result of the sanctions, including children. And I'll never forget Madeleine Albright, who was asked about this on television, saying it was worth the price.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. You know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
If you take the sanctions and then all the death that followed the invasion in 2003, would you say that what the U.S. has done in Iraq amounts to genocide?
No, I tend to be very wary of the use of that term. It's a term that gets thrown around with regard to Ukraine. The Putin is charged with genocide. There's no doubt in my mind that the Ukraine war is a criminal undertaking. No doubt in my mind that Putin is a brutal, ruthless dictator who, now that he's gotten himself into this fix, will probably resort to just about anything in order to save his skin. But this is not genocide. The Ukrainian people are not facing the prospect of extinction. And I think the same applies to Iraq. There's nothing I'm going to say that's going to defend U.S. policy with regard to Iraq. But I think that calling it genocide is a misnomer.
The reason I started off asking you about the reckoning that wasn't is because you wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs with that title. And in that essay, you said that 9/11, rather than launching the United States on a global crusade to kill a tactic, right? Eliminate all terrorists and punish the states that sponsor them. Simple dichotomous worldview that George W. Bush subscribed to. You said instead of that, it should have been our Suez moment. What did you mean?
Well, Suez refers to the debacle in 1956 that really sort of ended Great Britain's claim to being a superpower. And I think that for us, the post-9/11 experience, meaning the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, should have served as a comparable wake-up call. After Suez, the UK never again, I guess we could say that the Falklands campaign was a minor exception, but basically the UK never again really imagines that it has the capacity to undertake a truly independent foreign policy, and they become the loyal deputy of the United States of America, recognizing the limits of their own power. And I think that it would have been good if Iraq and Afghanistan had led us to undertake a similar reckoning, acknowledging the limits of our own power. Alas, I don't believe that that has happened in a meaningful sense.
The United Kingdom exhausted by 2 world wars, and then after World War II, the independence movements across the world, and they let their empire go. They didn't want to. They couldn't really hold on to it without spilling an enormous amount of blood and treasure to try to hold on to peoples who no longer wanted to be a part. But conversely, in the 1990s, well, those were the heady days for the United States. Unipolar world, the only superpower, and then 9/11 happens. I don't want to engage in hyperbole here, but it made us lose our minds. How could something like this happen to such a powerful country? Box cutters, 19 hijackers with box cutters.
Made us lose our mind is not unfair, I think, because something like that wasn't supposed to happen for a world's only superpower that fancied itself the indispensable. How could it be that these 19 thugs with box cutters could have visited such horrors upon the nation while our very expensive national security apparatus basically sat and watched? So again, one gets a sense of the humiliation in Washington. That, I do think, contributed directly to the folly that was to follow. It became necessary to show that 9/11 really didn't mean anything. There still was one superpower. History still had a direction. We were still the ones who determined that direction. When you peel back all of the reasons offered for why we needed to go to war with Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, the ultimate explanation is that in the eyes of the Bush administration, Iraq offered the opportunity to show that 9/11 really didn't matter, that we were still in charge.
I think there is some truth to that we invaded Iraq because we could. But, there's a contradiction there in the public statements that the Bush administration made all through 2002, then in 2003. They knew that Iraq was contained and weak and hollowed out, but at the same time, it was also Saddam Hussein and his hollowed out military, a threat to Western civilization.
Well, that's why the putative nuclear threat played such an important role in fashioning this argument. We can argue about whether or not Saddam's nukes were simply invented out of whole cloth by a bunch of dishonest senior U.S. officials, or whether there was at least a reasonable amount of evidence that made the nuke threat appear plausible. I must admit, I'm on the side that says they just made it all up because that was the argument they needed to put over in order to get the war that they wanted for completely unrelated reasons.
What consequences of the war are still with us today?
I think there is a general recognition, not confined to either the right or the left in our politics. There's a general recognition that our country's in deep trouble. We are a divided people. Our democracy has come to be dysfunctional. Why is that? All kinds of reasons. I've come to believe that one of those reasons is the recklessness of the Iraq War. And that if you want to understand, to really cut to the chase, if you want to understand the origins of Trumpism, of right-wing populism, of people threatening the Constitution, one important explanation is the anger on the part of many Americans about the Iraq War, its conduct, and its consequences. There is a sense of betrayal shared by many of our citizens. And I think the sense of betrayal, if you try to, trace it back to its origins, I think the Iraq War is an important explanation.
There are patterns in U.S. foreign policy. You trace those patterns in your foreign affairs essay to the aftermath of World War II. The late historian John Tierman had argued that the United States, time and again, would seek national rejuvenation through the cleansing power of violence. National rejuvenation through war, simply put. You see this in the rhetoric about Ukraine, although the United States certainly isn't sending GIs into Ukraine at this point and probably won't. To your earlier point about the simplistic rhetoric that President Biden engages in to justify U.S. support for the Ukrainians, this is a pattern that's been going on for quite a while. What's it going to take to break the pattern?
Pertinent question. I don't know the answer.
Neither do I. I wish I did. But
I'm a lot older than you are. So in many respects, the central episode in my life was the Vietnam War, which, not unlike our present moment, created really quite terrible divisions in American society. It wasn't just the war, of course, it was also issues related to civil rights, political assassinations, shocking political assassinations. But that was a time when the country seemed about to come apart. I mean, I do vividly remember the events of 1968. We're talking about the assassinations of Dr. King, of Robert Kennedy, the Tet Offensive.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
The decision of the President Johnson that he was not going to run for re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Sort of throwing the whole question of our politics wide open, the violence of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. It was a bad time. And in retrospect, it might have been reasonable to hope that out of that bad time, there would come a reckoning that could cleanse the country of some of the things that ailed it. But that really didn't happen. I guess we did find a way to make peace with the Vietnam War, mostly by forgetting it.
And with Vietnam itself.
Yeah, we certainly made,
now, normalized relations now. We have a better relationship. They have forgiven us to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's we fought this horrific war, 58,000 Americans dead. God knows the number of Vietnamese who were killed.
Millions.
Because we claimed that the survival of the Republic of Vietnam was absolutely essential to the security and safety of the United States of America. We lose. They reunite the country. And, whatever it is, 50 years later, they seem to be doing okay. And the issue that we fought for now seems so totally irrelevant, meaningless, that it's hard to remember why we intervened in Vietnam in the first place.
Yet we continue to have these hinge points in history or pivotal moments.
Supposedly now we are experiencing another one. That's what the Biden administration and I think many press commentators would have us believe, that this is the moment, this is the showdown between democracy and authoritarianism. In Vietnam, it was the showdown between democracy and communism. In the showdown earlier between democracy and fascism, there's always these sort of cosmic stakes that are going to be resolved. And somehow or other, the perception turns out to be utterly wrong. And the stakes are actually different than we imagined at the time. I think that's going to be true today. I'm not sticking up for the Russians. Putin's actions were utterly criminal and brutal. But no, this is not a moment that is going to decide the fate of democracy in the world.
I'm with you on that, and I find it demeaning that in today's discourse, I always have to preface my statements with saying, well, of course we know Putin is an SOB and the war was a crime, but,
But you better say it.
Yes.
Or you'll be accused of being an apologist.
I try to keep my cool when it comes to most things in the world. I get upset when I watch my favorite football team lose. But what I'm trying to say is we live in a world with a lot of phony outrage or outrage directed at trivial things. I do get angry at matters like this. And I've had to keep my cool recently when I've been reading some people writing apologies for the war or outright defending it, like Eli Lake, who wrote a column recently about, the war maybe wasn't so bad. Iraq is better off today. Or when I hear somebody say, the world is better off without Saddam Hussein. Robert Kagan, an Iraq War cheerleader, recently wrote in an essay in the same publication, Foreign Affairs, he wrote, "Only American power can keep the natural forces of history at bay."
I'm sitting here laughing because there's nothing funny here. But who the hell is Robert Kagan to discern the quote-unquote natural forces of history? Does history have natural forces? It seems to me not.
Yeah, he would say the natural order of things is disorder, and the United States came along, mistakes aside, but without us, the world will. I guess there's a fallacy here, right, that has pervaded American thought since 1945, and that is our intrusion into world affairs brings about order, that you can bring about order through war, and that's something I try...
No. Order and good. And enlightenment.
Benign. We're benign. Right.
Our role is not simply to maintain order, as the argument goes. It's not simply maintain. It is also to bring freedom, to advance history's cause, along with enforcing order. It's important to acknowledge this. The Kagans of the world, and I don't mean to pick on him because there's many people who basically share his perspective, that we are the source of salvation. that we are the chosen people.
We will be greeted as liberators.
We'll be greeted as liberators. Nothing is going to shake them from that conviction. Mr. Kagan, Dr. Kagan, basically writes the same essay in the same book over and over and over again. He has to sort of amend the argument to take into account the bits that no longer support it. The Iraq War would be an example. He's an ideologue.
Well, it's part of the pattern of colonialism and imperialism, isn't it? What doesn't work in country X, try again in country Y. And when those people start pointing their guns in the wrong direction, throw up your hands, leave, and then try it in country Z.
And also insist that our aims in country X were benign, were enlightened. All we wanted for the people of South Vietnam is that they should be free. That was the argument made by the Lyndon Johnson administration.
From communist aggression, as he put it.
An Asia so threatened by communist domination would certainly imperil the security of the United States itself.
Or foreign aggression, as if the Vietnamese were foreign. It was their country. Sorry, I don't mean to sound so preachy today, Andrew. You're my guest, and I should let you do most of the talking. Let's play Stump the Historian. Which American president said the following? It's easy to say that we really have no interests in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot indeed, and we should not do everything or be everywhere, but where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so.
Okay, I give.
That could be almost any American president outside of Trump. That was Bill Clinton in 1999. Yeah. The 90s are often described as a decade of drift in U.S. foreign policy. Do you agree that it was also no? What about a missed opportunity to reevaluate things after the Cold War ended?
That for sure. But I mean, it becomes a do-nothing decade in comparison to 9/11 and the events that follow. But the 1990s was the moment when we really kicked off the penchant for military interventionism that then became such a signature of the last few decades. Berlin Wall falls in the fall of 1989. December of 1989, right on the edge of the 1990s, George Herbert Walker Bush intervenes in Panama to overthrow Noriega. 9 months later, Saddam invades and annexes Kuwait, and George Herbert Walker Bush embarks upon a major intervention. In the months that follow, he intervenes in northern Iraq in order to supposedly protect the Kurds. And we soon thereafter begin edging into the Balkans with bombing campaigns and ultimately leading to occupations. I'm not going to reiterate the entire history of the time. But the point is, I think it's relatively clear that whereas the bias for national security policymakers prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the bias was in favor of containment. That didn't mean passivity, but it meant a certain wariness about intervention. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the bias is in favor of action. So we have these interventions, large and small. I personally think that the most important, the missed lesson of the early 1990s was Somalia. We intervene in Somalia. George Herbert Walker Bush intervenes in Somalia for reasons of human rights. There's no really strategic interest there.
To end starvation,
Clinton inherits the intervention, ups the ante. We end up with October firefight in Mogadishu, which is a humiliating failure on the part of the U.S. military. Erased from our history, even though this was suggestive of what happens when you send in very elite U.S. forces into an ugly urban environment fighting against highly motivated insurgents. They didn't do well, and that repeats itself on a far larger scale over a longer period of time in both Afghanistan and Iraq.
So the 1990s, rather than spurring a reassessment of what we need to do in the world to keep ourselves safe, It was step on the gas because the Soviet Union's not around anymore. And
Exactly right.
That's why that Clinton quote, I think, is so important, because it comes at the end of his presidency. And for the prior decade, again, without the Soviet Union, the idea was, well, now what do we do? What is our foreign policy going to center around? Back in 1990, I think this is another important point to make. In 1990, after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam, historian Jeffrey Engel has uncovered this in the documents. The initial response inside the Bush administration, which had many of the same people who would be in the next Bush administration, the initial response on the part of people like Dick Cheney was, what does it matter if a barrel of oil has a Kuwaiti or Iraqi flag on it? Meaning, so what? This is not something that we need to get involved in. They changed their minds. New World Order. If we allow this tin pot dictator to get away with it, then who else would try to get away with something like that? It was seen as an opportunity. And that's not conspiracy talk. President Bush the first President Bush, made it clear in his speeches where he mentions New World Order.
And we stand today at a unique and extraordinary moment. The crisis in the Persian Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era.
And this new order, post-Soviet Union, is now being tested by Saddam Hussein.
To me, the other sort of ironic dimension here is, wait a second, what were U.S. relations with Saddam Hussein before the intervention of 1990? Oh, throughout the decade of the 1980s, the centerpiece of history in that part of the world was the Iran-Iraq War, begun by Saddam Hussein, who was supported by the United States of America. We didn't support Saddam Hussein because we thought he was a wonderful guy. But I mean, give me a break that we are all about freedom and democracy and liberal values. We were there doing whatever we could, short of providing U.S. forces, to try to assist Saddam in this war of aggression that he began. I mean, the whole thing is so fraught with, it's not comic, it's just, it's too dark, but fraught with contradictions.
Well, people don't pay attention, right? Average Americans.
People don't pay attention. That's the title of your next book.
Well, that would be my first book.
People don't pay attention.
Well, to your earlier point about the shock of 9/11, well, that was in part because we weren't really paying I shouldn't say we without clarifying who do I mean. I mean, the American people weren't really familiar with Al-Qaeda. The Clinton administration, people like Dick Clark were trying to find bin Laden. They were focused on it. The Bush administration paid no attention to Al-Qaeda during its first 9 months. It didn't come up in the debates with Al Gore. I mean, it really wasn't front and center. Condi Rice was a specialist in Russian history and things like that. But about Saddam in the 1980s, he did launch the war against Iran over the Al-Shabaab waterway, which he had ceded to Iran in 1975. He then regretted that. War of aggression. Then it starts going badly for him, and the United States didn't want Iran to win now. Right. So we come to Saddam's rescue. We really helped him with intelligence, things like that. The Reagan administration saved him. Somebody at one point said something like, it's too bad both sides can't lose. So then now in 1990, he's Hitler.
Exactly.
And, history did repeat itself in 2003. Here's Hitler again.
Yeah.
That wasn't really a question, but... Do you think there's any point in debating things like, well, if only we hadn't disbanded the Iraqi army in 2003 or got rid of the Ba'ath Party and made hundreds of thousands of people with weapons unemployed, maybe things would have gone better in Iraq? Think there's any point in debating that?
There's a point, except that kind of debate evades the larger questions. And the larger questions have to do with the decision to go into Iraq in the first place and the justification. So, the conduct of the campaign obviously is not trivial, but I think that we shouldn't let discussion of the conduct of the campaign eclipse the discussion over the causes of the war and the mistakes that the United States made at that time and the assumptions that have informed those mistakes. The biggest assumption, I think, being the expectation that the U.S. military was going to achieve a quick and decisive victory.
Your background is in the military. You were a lieutenant
long ago.
Lieutenant colonel, right?
No, a real colonel.
Real colonel. Sorry, I just demoted you. Last question for you, Andrew Bacevich. One of your points in your foreign affairs essay, I must cite my sources, right? I don't want to borrow your words without acknowledging that while I'm interviewing you. You said that we just can't get over our excessive confidence in the efficacy of military power. Projection of military power. So how do we break this pattern? We've had so much failure when it comes to war. Why do we still think it works?
I mean, the key point here is that we don't necessarily get to decide. I personally think that the Ukraine war was avoidable. Well, we got it. It's here. We are proxy participants. I would like to see the war end as quickly as possible. No indications that I can see, either on the part of the Biden administration or of Mr. Putin, that either side is going to give way anytime soon. Certainly, President Zelensky is determined to pursue the war. He has some real justification for doing so. What I'm getting to is the longer this war drags on, it seems to me the greater likelihood that we're going to see the use of nuclear weapons, or at least the threatened use of nuclear weapons. And then the jig is up. The American people support the Ukraine war, I think, in very considerable part because there are no Americans dying or at risk of dying. But if this thing goes nuclear, then, I don't know how the public would respond.
Well, some people believe that Russia might use tactical weapons to, say, save Crimea, if it comes to that.
Right. Once we cross that threshold, I mean, there's been a taboo in place since August of 1945 that these weapons must not be used again. Came precariously close to that taboo being overturned in October of 1962 at the time of the missile crisis. But since then, it's been sacrosanct. It's as sacrosanct as most things are in international politics. If that taboo gets violated, I think then it's Katie bar the door. And it's not simply going to be our sacrifice, our security that's going to be at risk, but the well-being of the planet is going to be at risk. That's why I think there's an urgency to bring this war to an end that doesn't seem to figure in the ongoing discussion of the Iraq war.
We also face fundamental questions about the commitment to the most basic of principles. Would we stand up for the sovereignty of nations? Would we stand up for the right of people to live free from naked aggression? Would we stand up for democracy? 1 year later, we know the answers. Yes, we would stand up for sovereignty, and we did. Yes, we would stand up for the right of people to live free from aggression, and we did. And we would stand up for democracy, and we did. And yesterday, I had the honor to stand with President Zelensky in Kyiv to declare that we will keep standing up for these same things.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll be joined by the Iraqi journalist Gaith Abdul Ahad to discuss his new book, A Stranger in Your Own City. He covered the U.S. invasion and the aftermath. We're going to get more of the Iraqi perspective. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.